Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Civil War. Our questions to think about: what advantages did the United States have in the Civil War? What advantages did the Southern states have in the Civil War? What was the military strategy of the United States during the Civil War? And what was the military strategy of the Southern states during the Civil War? Before we get into the story here, I want to clarify some terms. A lot of times when people talk about the Civil War, they talk about the North versus the South, or the Union versus the Confederacy, or the blue versus the gray as a reference to the colors of the uniforms. I'm going to try to refer to this as the struggle of the United States government, the Union, versus the rebellion in the Southern states, just to clarify that secession is not legal. So first of all here, taking a look at the North, the population count at the start of the Civil War in the North was about 22 million, with about 9 million in the Southern states. The other thing to keep in mind with that number is that roughly 4 million people living in the Southern states were enslaved. So obviously those individuals are not going to be supporting the Confederacy or secession. So one of the first advantages that the North has is a roughly 4-to-1 population advantage, which means they have many more men that they can call into the army. The second thing is industry. This is what we were talking about before with the market revolution versus the cotton kingdom. Almost all of the industry, almost all of the manufactured goods in the United States were produced in the North. And that includes roughly 97% of the firearms and 96% of the railroad equipment. So this is definitely an advantage that the United States has against the rebels. The other thing, and we've talked about this before with the market revolution and the transportation revolution, is that looking at this map, you see it very clearly. The North, or the United States, has the greater advantage of transportation. This map shows railroad tracks within the United States, and it's clear that the North has the advantage. And what that means is that the North can very quickly transport men and supplies from one part of the country to the other very quickly. The final advantage that the United States has is sea power. The Southern states are going to create a navy, but the North definitely has that advantage early on. We have warships that are going to be able to blockade Southern ports to prevent commerce from going in and out of those Southern cities. In addition, in the inland waterways, in other words, the rivers, federal gunboats and transports play an even more direct role in securing the Union's control of the major rivers, the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, and the Mississippi River. This doesn't mean that the Southern states don't have their own advantages. When the Civil War begins, the Southern states are going to enjoy a major geographic advantage. The Southern states are going to fight a defensive war on its own territory. Now, from a military standpoint, that means they're going to be close to their supply lines. But ideologically, it reminds me very much of what we saw in the American Revolution. We talked about it before with George Washington. He understood that in order to be successful, all the colonies had to do is not lose. And that's a huge advantage. And that's really where the Southern states find themselves right now, is that if at any point in time the United States government simply gives up, then the Southern states are successful in leaving the Union. The other thing, though, and this is a definite advantage for the Southern states, there are strong military leaders. Abraham Lincoln is going to struggle early on in the war to find a competent general to lead the United States Army. But the Southerners have a great tradition of strong military leaders, whether it's Robert E. Lee or Thomas Stonewall Jackson or Jeb Stuart or whoever. They have this plethora of really strong military leaders. And then finally, the tradition of hunting and the use of firearms is important when you consider the average soldier in the Confederate Army. Many of the men coming out of New York City or Boston or other major urban areas of the North had never fired a gun before in their lives. But with hunting and the use of firearms as a tradition in the South, many more of their soldiers are familiar with weapons. Coming now to the military strategies, the North is going to employ what is called the anaconda strategy. So think about the big constricting snake, and that's really what this is all about. We're going to squeeze the life out of the South. This is a three-pronged strategy. The first part is to defend Washington and to put pressure on the southern capital of Richmond, Virginia. Second, a naval blockade of the South. One of the only things that the South has is cotton, and they're going to try to use that cotton to purchase weapons and supplies to fight the war. But if that cotton can't leave the United States, then their whole strategy falls apart. So the U.S. Navy is going to use its warships to prevent commerce, to prevent trade from taking place in those southern port cities. The third component here is to control the main interior waterways or the rivers of the United States, particularly the Mississippi River. One of the major strategies here is that the United States government wants to control the entire length of the Mississippi River for two reasons. Number one, it divides the South in two parts. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas would be separated from the rest of the southern states. And the South would no longer be able to use the river as transport of goods and supplies and troops. The Southern strategy, as I mentioned, is really heavily geared on selling the cotton. The outbreak of the Civil War had placed the British government in a quandary because Confederates had threatened to cut off access to Southern cotton if Britain didn't support the rebel cause. Well, President Lincoln, on the other hand, had warned Britain that official recognition of the Confederacy would lead to war with Great Britain. So in other words, if Great Britain recognizes the legitimacy of the Confederate States of America in order to maintain their cotton supply, then they risk going to war with the United States. And so the Southern strategy is, number one, to fight to a stalemate, to try to get the United States government to simply give up, but also to seek that foreign aid, maybe from Britain, maybe from France. And as the title of this book suggests, trade cotton for weapons. Unfortunately for the Southerners, this strategy is not really going to work. So coming back to our questions to think about, what advantages did the United States have in the Civil War? They have a larger population. Most of the manufactured goods are produced in the North. Most of the railroad tracks and other transportation routes are located in the northern states. And the fact that the United States government has a navy that is able to blockade those southern ports. Second, what advantages did the southern states have in the Civil War? They are fighting a defensive war, which is a definite advantage. They have strong military leaders that at the beginning of the war, the North lacks. And then finally, the tradition of hunting and the use of firearms means that the average Confederate soldier is more comfortable with weaponry than the average Northern soldier. What was the military strategy of the United States during the Civil War? That is the anaconda strategy that has three prongs. Defend Washington, put pressure on Richmond, gain control of the interior waterways, particularly the Mississippi River, and then blockade the southern port cities so they can't sell their cotton. And then what was the military strategy of the Southern states during the Civil War? Try to fight to a stalemate. Try to get the United States government to simply give up. And then second, try to gain a foreign ally like Britain in order to supply the things the South didn't have. So stay tuned for part 3 of the Civil War.